Good evening, everyone, and welcome to this Forum for Philosophy event on the nature of beauty. Our topic for the next hour is the relationship between art and science and the role played by the concept of beauty in both art and science. We'll be thinking about what science can do for art. It's a familiar idea that art draws inspiration from the natural world. But what about the more abstract side of science? What about maths, physics, chemistry? Can these also be inspiration for art? And what about the practice of science? What about laboratory practices and processes? And we'll be thinking too about what art can do for science. Scientists will often talk about a theory or experiment as being beautiful. What does that mean? What counts as beautiful in science? How can it be that one theory can be more beautiful than another when at the end of the day they're just maths? And what's the significance of beauty in science? If one theory is more beautiful than another, is that really a reason to prefer it, or is it just a loose way of talking? Is beauty a guide to truth? Do we have any reason to expect the truth about the world to be beautiful? And it's a pleasure to be joined by Adrian Holme from the University of the Arts, London, and Milena Ivanova from the University of Cambridge, who'll be bringing us insight on these questions. And we're interested to hear your questions as well. You can post them at any time in the Q&A box in this webinar, and we'll mix them in as we go along. So let's start with you, Adrian. I mean, you're an artist. What are your favorite examples of science inspiring art?
Yes, thank you, Jonathan. I mean, I think, as you say, we're all very familiar with the way that nature inspires art. And one of the things I do is I teach on an illustration course as well as on the MA Art and Science at Central St Martin's. But there is also this kind of rather more direct connection when we're talking about art and science. And there are some works where science is featured directly or where science has inspired directly works of art. I mean, perhaps, Joseph Wright of Derby's famous painting, which is very familiar.
Bring that up. Yes, we have a few artworks to show you in the webinar that we'll describe for those listening to the podcast. But yeah, Joseph Wright of Derby, one of my all-time favorite paintings, I think. What is it, Adrian, that is that painting of the sort of bell jar, isn't it? Can you tell us what's going on in that painting?
Indeed. Well, there's quite a lot going on. So it's slide number 4. That's it. Yeah. So in this slide, you see a darkened room using the chiaroscuro technique attributed to people like earlier painters like Caravaggio. This was painted by Joseph Wright in 1768. So in a darkened room, there are a group of people situated around what is a kind of scientific experiment. And it's actually a demonstration, a rather theatrical demonstration of a scientific experiment. And it's the light is all from the center, from behind a glass vessel. There's a candle, and it lights the people's faces in this half light in a very, very dramatic way. And then right at the center, there is a figure who is almost like a kind of mad scientist, this kind of really long-haired and wild-looking man who is holding like a bell jar from at the top of the painting, from which air is being pumped, and a bird is in the jar. And the air has been pumped out, and this bird is fluttering or dying. We don't quite know.
This is a fearful painting in a way, isn't it? I mean,
it's a terrifying painting.
The bird is not got long to live, really. It's capturing this bird more or less at the point of death.
Yes, indeed. And we don't know really whether, I mean, he's looking to us, the main figure, the demonstrator, the scientist is looking, he's the only person that catches our eye in the painting. And he is almost like, I think, saying, you know, it's a challenge to us. It's up to us. Do we want the bird to die? Is he going to let in the air, perhaps, to let the air back in so the bird may revive? So it's a terrible scientific experiment. and
a demonstration
kind of portent.
The power of science, isn't it?
Yeah.
And the fearsome power of science. And
the fearsome, yes,
it's
it
a moral
is,
question, I suppose, isn't it? About the morality of science.
Very much, and the sense in which, you know, the sense in which science will often destroy the very subjects that it's investigating, or destroy the objects that it's investigating. It considers them as objects. So there's a kind of frightening portent, really, of things to come, if you like, in this painting, which is kind of almost in the era of Romanticism. It's just before the Romantics, but it's certainly got a romantic feeling.
It's a depiction, in a way, of the mastery of nature, isn't it, rather than of nature itself? Nature brought into the lab.
Yeah,
I suppose.
Yeah. And the bird who is fluttering pitifully in this evacuated jar with no air is kind of, in this, is the focus of the experiment, and the focus of our attention, and the focus of certain people in the room as well. There's a little girl at the bottom who is looking up, concerned and worried, perhaps. And one girl who won't look at it, you know, is hiding her head because it's so terrible. But I mean, in a sense, the way science proceeded after that, the kind of the victims, if you like, of the scientific experiments became really kind of marginalized and not, you know, not really worth depicting, perhaps, you know.
They get shut out of the picture altogether. I mean, Milena, should we bring you in on this? I mean, as a philosopher of science, what do you think we can learn from a painting like this about the art-science relationship?
I think one of the interesting things that we learn from specifically this period of time is that art and science, in a sense, are both public activities. So we have this understanding the experiment is not just for the scientist that is performing it, it actually has an audience. And this is really interesting, going back to the origin of the experimental practice, is that oftentimes the experiments are including audiences, and the experimenters at the time, I'm thinking about the Royal Society, 16th, 17th century, oftentimes are not thinking only about performing the experiment with a particular aim to confirm a theory or to see what happens under certain conditions, but they are thinking about the audience reactions. I'm thinking about Joseph 𝗶𝗵, for instance, who is talking about electric experimentation and experiments that are revealing electric phenomena. And he will oftentimes in his books talk about, you know, the awe-inspiring experiment, the experiment that made the audience have aesthetic experience. And I think that's really interesting. And this picture depicts this really nicely. That
the experiment itself is supposed to inspire awe in the viewers. And then Joseph Wright is, in a way, trying to convey that sense of awe to us.
Mm-hmm.
It is. And actually, there's, and I think it's very interesting what you're saying, Milena, about the sort of public nature of it, you know, and then it becomes more public through being a painting. And actually, when you look at this, the student once pointed out to me, we're looking at a table and there's a space for us at the table, as though we can walk into it and sit down and partake of this event.
We become like the children, don't we? We're the other child.
Yeah, that's right.
Looking up in a mix of fascination and horror.
I mean, I think maybe it's worth observing that there are other aspects. I don't know if you gave the title. It's called An Experiment on a Bird in the Air Pump. And there are other aspects to this, of other layers of iconography here. And the bird is reminiscent of the paraclete of the white bird representing the Holy Spirit, which you get in religious painting. And it's actually situated exactly where you would expect to find that in religious painting. So there's also a sense in which the air maybe represents the spirit, which is being pumped out of the jar. And there's also I believe there's a further alchemical reading of this, which is the moon is featured over on the right-hand side through a window in typical Joseph Wright of Derby style. And the moon in alchemy represents one of the sort of fundamental polarities of lunar Mercury, and the other polarity is the sun, and is sulphurous, the sun. So there's a kind of alchemical reading, and the moon and the sun kind of will collaborate in sort of in generating the the philosopher's stone
Magic.
generating change, driving change. So there's another alchemical layer to it and a religious layer in terms of the iconography.
It's depicting science as a source of magic almost, isn't it? The scientist looks rather like a magician, but
Yes,
also, as you're saying, with a link to alchemy.
He very much does. I mean, you might say it's a painting which kind of secularizes those forces of those alchemical views of the world and the religious views of the world. Or you might say it's a painting about science which alludes to and draws upon those other traditions.
So this is a fantastic example of how the processes of science and what goes on inside a lab can be a source of inspiration for art. Should we think a bit about how sort of theory can be an inspiration for art and the sort of abstract side of science? Do you want to give us some examples of that, Adrian?
Well, I suppose the one I was thinking about this, it's an interesting question. I mean, the one that really comes to mind is mathematics and geometry. And for those who are watching, there's the next slide and the one after. So slide number 5 going forward. Yeah. I mean, this is, I've just picked this one as I've always wanted to go to Isfahan and see the Islamic tiles on the mosques in Isfahan. But I mean, the extraordinary complexity of this design here of the Shah Mosque at Isfahan, which was the ancient capital of Iran.
So it's looking up at a ceiling, isn't it? A dome.
Looking up at a ceiling, yes, indeed. And you can see that it's all covered in tiles with the most intricate patterning. And in fact, there are shapes as well within this. So there's an extraordinary, I'm not enough of a mathematician to explain the mathematics behind it, but there's a considerable amount of mathematics lying behind this in a Muslim culture, which was where, you know, the representation of people, and I think sometimes even animals, was prohibited.
So mathematics has this special significance for Islamic art, then, because of the way that more literal, less abstract depictions of nature were not allowed.
Yes, and I think I mean, certainly in the West, in Western art, I mean, geometry was also aligned with reason and God, seen as a god of reason. So in a sense, geometry had a divine aspect that we can trace back to the Greeks as well, with people like Pythagoras.
Milena, do you want to come in on the example of the Shah Mosque?
Well, when I was looking at this, I was just thinking about how fundamental geometry was in the works of ancient Egyptians and ancient Greeks, sculptors, artists, and how much work they actually had to do to think about mathematical laws, geometrical laws, proportion, symmetry, in order to create innovative work. And I was thinking especially about, you know, these steps that Greek statues made in the times when, you know, we go from a very stable, you know, male figure to actually making a step, how much work the kind of sculptors had to do to understand the laws of physics, but also
the
geometry.
Sculptors would have to be mathematicians, in effect.
Exactly, and actually some of them were very much involved in working mathematics, right? So Philocletus, for instance, I'm thinking about, and he worked very much intensely in the contemporary geometry, and even wrote, we don't have any, I think, remaining evidence of this, but, you know, it's so said that he even wrote like a canon of how you have to do proportion to represent in the most ideal way, you know, the human body. So I think it's really interesting how there's always been a correlation between artistry and, you know, to do art well, you have to do a little bit of science. You have to understand a little bit about geometrical laws, mathematics, and it's not always a matter of inspiration, but sometimes it's actually quite instrumental for achieving the goal that you have as an artist.
Yeah, it's great to raise that question, I think, of whether the relationship is always one of inspiration, because we talk about science inspiring art, but sometimes the connections seem to be a lot more intimate than that. How do you see the relationship, Adrian?
The relationship between...
Well, is it the case that the science is inspiring the art, Sometimes it is, I suppose. Sometimes that is exactly what's going on, and perhaps Joseph Wright is an example of that. But that's not always what's going on.
No, I think the relationship is more complex and more subtle. I mean, I think the issue is that science and art were not always as separate as we might conceive of them today. I mean, there's a lot of evidence that in Leonardo's day, and we think of Leonardo as an artist and a scientist, and that becomes that archetypal kind of choice of someone who exemplifies science and art. But actually, there was not a great conceptual difference really between science and art in the time of Leonardo. The science and art were very much about knowledge and skill. So if art was kind of like about skill and science was about knowledge, you bring together knowledge and skill in quite a logical way. There wasn't that great conceptual divide between the two, and Leonardo, and there also weren't those disciplinary divisions. Leonardo was able to operate very much as a scientist and an early empiricist in the kind of later Western tradition, the European tradition, but also as an artist. And I think for someone like Leonardo, this was all part of the same enterprise as kind of investigating and representing nature.
There's a question from the audience about fractals that I think is quite interesting. That ceiling of the Shah Mosque there looks a bit like a fractal, though I'm not quite sure if it is or not. But that seems like a great example of a pattern that we see in nature that's then also become this motif throughout the history of art as well.
Absolutely, and I mean, I'm no great mathematician, but I mean, they do look very much like fractal patterns. It'd be interesting to have a mathematician give us a view on that, actually. But certainly, I mean, pattern is something that runs so sort of deep into who and what we are, isn't it? And as kind of creatures that discern and recognize patterns as well as reproduce them for various reasons, including for pure pleasure.
So would you like to give us one more example of a work of art that you think illustrates this art-science dynamic? We've seen how it's not always one of inspiration, that sometimes it's about depicting abstract patterns for which you actually have to learn the maths yourself, and an artist has to be a mathematician. And sometimes it's about trying to, I suppose, analyze the changes that science is bringing to the world. You can think of Joseph Wright of Derby in that way. Is there another example that you think further complicates that relationship?
Well, I think one example that is particularly interesting, I think, is slide number 8, which is Ólafur Eliasson. And
this is a new, relatively new piece of work, isn't it? Do you want to?
Yeah, so there are various incarnations of this. This was it was originally produced in 2002, and then this is from 2004. And what we see here on the slide is a large, it's a kind of gallery space, and there's a circular space built into this, and the whole space is bathed in color, and the title is
called 360-degree room for all colors.
Room for all colors, yes. So what you have here are slowly changing colors, and the person enters this space and is kind of bathed and surrounded by the colors. So in a sense, it's quite a sort of disorientating space, I think. But as the colors shift, it is said, and I haven't experienced this directly, I'd really love to, but it's said that there are more colors visible than actually are physically produced by the lights, because the other colors are created by our sort of perceptual system. They're kind of created by the brain, if you like. So Eliasson is almost like a sort of scientific experiment on our optical system, and at the same time framed as a work of art, as a kind of pleasurable aesthetic experience. So it's kind of both beautiful, but also, you are within an experiment, if you like.
So art as an experiment.
I think so. And I think there's quite a lot of this in Eliasson's work. He did a lot of work on, and he's an artist who thinks very, very deeply about the science of things, I think. I mean, he did pieces that that worked upon the after image, you know, sort of projecting a shape and then it would disappear and you'd see the after image in its complementary color, you know, so really playing around with vision in a kind of toying with our perceptions and our vision, if you like, as an artist. But for the and you know, in the way he talks about his work, he's kind of interested in the way that people respond. So it's as though he's watching the viewers, as though it is like a kind of a laboratory, you know, you're in his experiment, I think.
So sort of experimenting with the possibilities of human vision and subjective experience. It's almost an experiment on consciousness, a kind of consciousness science.
Yes, and on that gap between the you know, that gap between the world as it is physically supposed to be and our subjective response to it, which is kind of, in a way you might say, it's bridged by our perception. I mean, it's going back to sort of Cartesian model, I suppose, in a way.
What do you think, Milena? Do you think art can actually be science?
Maybe in some of these, we have something to learn from how subjects are reacting in these kind of environmental settings. So perhaps it is an experiment in, you know, and there's something to be gained by observing people's reactions. I actually wanted to ask Adrian something that he said about this experiment. It was, you know, we claim that this is an aesthetic experience and it's giving us some kind of maybe pleasure, but you also said it's very disorienting for people to be in the experiment. So in a sense, it's giving us feelings of discomfort, and maybe it's just not particularly pleasant after all. And I wanted to ask, you know, how many of these do you think ultimately scientifically related experiments that artworks that are kind of motivated by maybe challenging some concepts that we have, something that is very intuitive to us, challenging such assumptions that we make maybe, or some of our experiences that we take for granted, and whether that goes back to also experiments that have been done in science since a long time ago, that, you know, it oftentimes the experiment brought discomfort. I mean, we already saw the first painting that showed us that, you know, it was not particularly pleasant to look at this poor bird. But there's also many other experiments that were, in a sense, generating feelings of sublime fear of nature. So yes, I wanted to ask you about this.
I think that's beautifully put, Milena. Really, the way you've sort of explained it, it's kind of. I think you're absolutely right that the art is often sort of working at that sort of interplay of comfort and discomfort, of pleasure and sort of putting you on edge. You know, the works that are really, really interesting, they often kind of do a bit of both. And whether it's a sublime thing of a kind of feeling a certain terror or a certain awe, or whether it's, I mean, you know, in works that I've made in the past, you know, I never wanted the viewer to be too comfortable. I always wanted to be a little bit destabilized, but also I was also working with a kind of aesthetic of pleasure, and I think it's really interesting the way that, yeah, I think that's really absolutely right. And Joseph Wright, it's clear that it's, you know, there's a certain kind of thrill maybe in the kind of the horrible nature of what we're seeing. The dark, sublime kind of atmosphere around it. So it's both disturbing, a kind of mixture of disturbing and pleasure. I mean, it's kind of, it's interesting, isn't it? Because I mean, it's just making me think really that art is often working on that kind of, on that dialectic between pleasure and discomfort. And perhaps work that is less interesting is maybe just, you know, on a kind of very beautiful kind of contemplative, but maybe might appear somewhat bland.
Certainly shows that the aim is not always to evoke a sense of beauty, is it? I mean, arguably the Shah Mosque is beautiful, but I'm not sure a bird suffocating in an air pump is beautiful. Sometimes the aim is to evoke these feelings of awe, or even horror, terror, disorientation.
I wonder how much of these aims as an artist we have and as a scientist, maybe because we have this underlying assumption that nature is very big and very strong, and we are a little bit fearful of not knowing enough about it. So these kind of experiences that we have, for instance, through this really interesting artwork, kind of generating these responses in us because we have this assumption about nature. Somehow it's mysterious.
It's a source of fear that nature is this unknowable, huge thing.
Well, nature has these, nature has these sort of diametrically kind of contrary aspects, doesn't it, of kind of pleasure and beauty and terror and horror, which you can even see, you've only got to go to your garden and see what's going on in the garden at this sort of small level of, the blackbird pulling the worm out of the lawn or whatever, we see nature, and this is kind of personified sometimes in religion, isn't it? I think in Hinduism, isn't it? Shiva, Kali, this sort of dichotomy, between the sort of the generation and the destruction. They're both there in nature, and I suppose we face them in respect to our own bodies as well, don't we? This kind of embodied experience, this sort of the pleasure in having a body, and the pleasure you can get from a body, and the kind of terror of the the dissolution of the body, the end of the body, harm to the body.
Yeah, let's mix in a couple of questions from the audience then. There's one here about, would art have the same appeal or meaning if it was machines creating it? So if it was machines delving into maths and science and constructing art algorithmically?
It's a good question. I think it might. I think it might, and we are. Yeah, I think it might well do, and I think the way we've used machines for a very long time in making work and making things, and if people are composing in Photoshop or whatever, that is a complicated kind of.
But we think there's always a human artist there, don't we? I suppose this question is alluding to the possibility that in the future, or even now, there might not be a human artist at all.
It's a very interesting question, and it may be right. I'm a little skeptical about that. I think it maybe we may be. I've got a feeling that machines may just do some of the rather banal and stupid things we do rather better and rather quicker. But I'm not sure it's a huge debate.
Yes, can I just say that, I've been quite interested in this being in Cambridge. Of course, there's so many colleagues that work on artificial intelligence, and I've seen works of art that are created by artificial intelligence, and I wouldn't, first of all, know that that was the case. They're really sophisticated and really interesting. But honestly, if I had just seen them, not knowing who the creator was, I wouldn't have distinguished anything about the reaction, because they're really sophisticated, interesting works of art. And I think that's a really, really great question, because when we think we need to have a human creator, we make certain assumptions about, us being special, having some kind of special capacities. But maybe we have sophisticated enough now machines and can, we don't directly program them. They can do things on their own, right? They learn and they update and they create algorithms themselves. So it's really interesting to think whether we can actually attribute creativity to these machines. I think it's really not straightforward how we answer this.
Do you think it must depend in some way on whether machines can be conscious? Because I think a lot of the appeal and fascination of art comes from this idea that it's connecting with someone else and their experiences and their point of view on the world. They're conveying something to you about a subjective point of view. And so if machines in the future also have their own subjective points of view, it's going to be fascinating to see their art and try to understand those points of view. But if they're not conscious, and if they're just sort of mimicking what we do when we're producing art, then it might not be so interesting.
Indeed. I mean, it raises some interesting fundamental questions about the nature of consciousness and where consciousness is, and whether it really is something peculiar to humans, which I don't think it is personally, whether it's even something peculiar to animals. I mean, some philosophers sort of suggest that it might be. I mean, David Bohm, the quantum physicist, sort of was suggesting in a way that consciousness may be something that is just part of the cosmos, part of the universe, part of
panpsychism. It's not our topic here, but it is certainly a view that's out there.
Yeah.
So there's another question here from the audience. Is there a definition for what art is? Is art just to create an experience? And then this leads on to the interesting question, could science and scientific experiments themselves be artworks?
It's a good question. And definitions of what art is are sort of manifold, really.
Yeah, I mean, you'll never get two people to agree on a definition of what art is, but the question of whether a scientific experiment can itself be an artwork and how that might depend on what we think art is, that really is interesting, isn't it?
Personally, I think there's enough of a potential overlap that some scientific experiments might overlap and be kind of in the nature of artworks.
If you think of the painting, the 𝗔𝗱𝗿𝗶 painting, where that public display, that performance, that performance is an artwork, isn't it, as well as a scientific experiment.
And as Milena was explaining earlier, about the sort of public nature of science and the requirements science has for sort of public demonstration, which I thought was a really interesting point.
So shall we move on then to the science art relationship, I suppose? What art can do for science, how considerations of beauty enter into science. Milena, what do you think about that? I mean, what are scientists really talking about when they say that a theory or an experiment is beautiful?
Mm-hmm. Well, I want to start by simply noting that we are going to find these aesthetic judgments about scientific products in all sorts of places, right? So we're going to find scientists claiming that phenomena in the world are beautiful. So just by looking at some phenomenon obtaining, we can say that phenomenon is beautiful. So the subject that we study is beautiful.
Rainbows, for example.
Right, and electric phenomena, looking at solar eclipses, whatever, whatever can interest an inquirer, you can find beauty in it. In fossils, molecules, anything we observe under a microscope.
Ammonites.
And then, so this is about the phenomena themselves, right? And this will be a big question that we think about today: whether nature is beautiful, and how do we even understand? What does it even mean to know that? Whether nature is beautiful. The other side is, of course, to think about the products that we produce. We produce theories, as you said, experiments, we produce images, all sorts of a variety of products of scientific engagement. And then the question is, what do we mean when we say an experiment or theory is beautiful? What kind of qualities are we looking for? And then there's also another way to think about this question, as in the very process of creating something, whether it's a theory or an experiment, we might be involving aesthetic judgments, and how we end up justifying those products is really interesting again. So when it comes to theory or experiments, sometimes scientists will say that there is no one definition of beauty, and philosophers can agree with this claim as well. But if we look into kind of claims that are being made, and I mostly read physicists, sometimes biologists.
Yeah, could you give us an example?
Yes, absolutely. We can find that there are some kind of constant values that seem to be lumping together when we talk about beauty. So a lot of the time we'll say Newtonian mechanics is beautiful. Why is that the case? And we'll point, well, it's simple. It has few equations. It can explain a lot of phenomena. So it's unifying. We think about general relativity. It has symmetry, simplicity, again, unifies concepts. And we think about experiments in the same way as well. So one of the experiments that is oftentimes praised as the most beautiful experiment in biology, the Mendelssohn-Stowe experiment on DNA replication, when scientists are talked,
Could you tell us a bit about what that experiment involves and why we think of it beautiful? On the face of it, you think biochemistry, how is that going to be beautiful?
Well, this is the thing. When you read about the history of biology and you read historians presenting this experiment, what we oftentimes are referring to here is that this experiment was really important and gave a really important answer to a question that was bothering the community. So in 1953, we have the discovery of DNA structure, and we know it's a double helix structure, but we don't really know how the structure is replicating, how this molecule replicates. And then there are free contenders available on the market, let's say, entertained by the community. And this experiment, the way it was set up, ultimately discredited two of them and confirmed one of them, the semi-conservative called replication. And so when scientists are reflecting on this experiment, well, they will tell us, it gave us a definitive answer to a question. And it was also simple. It was a simple setup. It didn't need to be replicated many times. In fact, it's claimed that it didn't have to be replicated at all. It followed simple steps. And so very often the kind of aesthetic values that are related to the experiment are not that dissimilar to the ones that we find in phrasing theories, simplicity, elegance, being able, what we call aptness, being good for the job, giving us an answer or explaining certain phenomena that we're interested in.
So beauty in science, it's partly about simplicity in some sense, and partly, by the sound of it, also about neatness, cleanness, this idea that we don't want science to be too messy. So when an experiment cleanly knocks out two hypotheses and leaves one remaining, that makes it more beautiful.
Yes, absolutely. And one of our questions that should bother us a lot is whether these values that we just discussed, simplicity, symmetry, unity, scope, are uniformly understood by different communities, whether they change, whether along the way in the development of science we do lose some of those or we gain some. And if that is happening, if aesthetic criteria change, then it becomes really
probably will, won't they? Do you think the standards of beauty have changed in science over time?
Well, some philosophers think so, and that's why they can challenge the idea that much can be done by this concept of beauty, or at least they think we have to do a lot of work to justify why we base preferences for theories, for instance, on grounds of such considerations. And so I think you can make the arguments both ways. You can say, well, we do observe some kind of changes in science. We see that along the line we have let go of some kind of aesthetic considerations that we used to consider as part and parcel of the concept of beauty.
So there was this idea, wasn't there, at one point, that action at a distance is very bad, very inelegant, very ugly, and then Newton's theory viewed through that lens is an ugly theory.
Well, it depends exactly how you will ultimately measure the simplicity here, right? If you measure it, how well is this sitting with other pre-existing metaphysical commitments? For instance, maybe it's not simple if you carry weight on the equations, the parameters that are involved in the theory, maybe you reach a different conclusion. That in itself is a difficult problem. Like, do we have some kind of standardized ways of measuring these values? But I wanted to kind of refer to the work of James McAllister, who's really worked on this idea about revolutions in science. And he thinks that our aesthetic ideals do change, and what we mean by beauty in different periods will change.
So what are his examples then? Is there an example of how the standards of beauty have changed?
Yes, I mean, a couple of things, right? So, well, going from circular to elliptical motion in astronomy would be an example where we lost circles, and that's important because the circles were considered to be the perfect kind of geometrical figure by which we explain the natural world. So there was a lot of resistance to accept.
So from the geocentric picture of Ptolemy and co through to Kepler and his ellipses.
Exactly, and this McAllister explains this really nicely because he thinks, there was resistance for the community to accept this theory. Part of the resistance was based on the fact that the community did not want to update their concept of beauty. And we have another phenomenon like this in the transition to quantum mechanics, where we have now phenomena that we can't really visualize, and that's very difficult to accept the theory. And again, like I also argue that, this is another example where we have lost something in our aesthetic canon that used to be dominant and now is losing centrality. And then we also gain along the way criteria that are concerned part and parcel of the concept of beauty, such as symmetry, because symmetry wasn't really a consideration before more recent physical
So
theory.
do you think beauty is a force for conservatism in science? Is it usually the new that's ugly and the things we've got now that are beautiful?
Well, we certainly have some examples here that give us this idea that there is resistance to revise the canon with which scientists work. And it's very interesting. There's a really fascinating work that came out a couple of years ago by Sabine Hossenfelder. And the book that she wrote was called, it's called Lost in Math, How Beauty Leads Physics Astray. And she develops a really, I think two very important arguments. But her idea is that because oftentimes we develop some kind of comfort about what values seem to have gotten us into a good state in physics, we continue to project them, we continue to expect them. And oftentimes we're very, not very sensitive to the fact that sometimes these ideas are not going to lead us to productive ways. And so she argues that sometimes beauty actually is like a bias that is preventing us from making progress, perhaps.
There's something scientists should train themselves out of, stop seeing everything in terms of beauty.
Well, this is the thing. I think I don't think that's the argument she makes, but if we took that line of argument that let's dispense of these beauty discussions or these criteria, they're not leading us anywhere, or maybe we started with this claim at the beginning that maybe we're not even saying anything meaningful when we talk about a theory being beautiful. Maybe we're just...
But one view, I suppose, is we're just reporting our own emotional reactions to it.
Yes, this pertains to the very old-fashioned logical positivist tradition that we have in the 1930s about context of discovery and justification, right? So thinking about any ideas, any personal factors that are contributing to how we come up with ideas, how we come up with a theory, the process by which we create it, and the personal values that impact on the creation should be irrelevant to the evaluation of our knowledge. What matters is how is this theory, after we produce it with whatever values we infused it with, how is this theory squaring with the evidence? If we have good evidence for it, we should believe it. If we don't, we shouldn't. But we shouldn't really lump together the epistemic question about knowledge with the psychological question. Do
you really think that's an old-fashioned view? I bet that's still a very widespread view among scientists.
It's widespread in some circles. It's
not your circles.
Well, I think that was definitely the starting point, having been raised in a logical positivist tradition myself. That was the starting point to how I thought about aesthetic considerations initially as well. But I found it very difficult to accept that view, because I think it makes it really difficult understanding, why, if aesthetic judgments are nothing but just statements about our confidence in how well a theory squares with the evidence, then how can we understand the fact that scientists will oftentimes use those kind of claims to tell us we should trust the theory because of its beauty? And we have those examples on and on again. We can say, well, we're just using this language to be impressionable, to kind of motivate us to think about the question, but they really don't mean anything about beauty statements themselves being about beauty of the theory. But oftentimes those kind of claims are made in contexts where we don't actually have a theory that's empirically supported. And these kind of judgments are used to convince us to believe the theory.
Yeah, is string theory an example of that? That people often say there's no evidence for or against it.
Yes, absolutely. Whether we're thinking about what we call now post-empirical science, or we're thinking about very old-fashioned questions about underdetermination, where we have more than one theory that fits our evidence. In those contexts, we seem to be having these statements by scientists that tell us that beauty is giving us good grounds to believe in the theory being true.
So in cosmology, for example, and astronomy, where we're testing hypotheses about things we can't see, like black holes. We had a forum event on black holes a little while ago, in which we talked about post-empirical science. I was pretty disturbed by the whole idea, to be honest. Science without evidence, what are we doing if we're not doing science with evidence?
A lot of questions emerge here, whether we should say that these theories are genuinely scientific, whether we'll ever have grounds to believe them on empirical foundations, what other non-empirical considerations should be entering in our evaluation of those theories, for sure. And I mean, not every proponent of string theory is defending their trust in the theory on aesthetic grounds. It's really not the case, but some are, and this has always been the case with the history of physics. Every time we've had a theory that perhaps has not yet obtained a lot of evidence in its favor, we will see that the proponents of the theory will utilize aesthetic claims. I'm thinking about Paul Dirac, and I'm thinking about Heisenberg and Einstein before the expeditions in 1919 to convince us about the tenability of general relativity.
Yeah.
Right? So
do you think this is a feature of, I suppose, cutting edge science, where we're really not sure which theory is right, and we're trying to say which one is worth investing in? You know, which of these is the more plausible, the more worthy of our time? You think it's there, perhaps, that considerations of beauty, simplicity, etc., really matter?
Well, I would say that these considerations enter in any layer of activity, right? Even
I'm sort of thinking about engineering. You know, if you're an engineer and someone says, build a bridge, well, you may want the bridge to be beautiful, but whether it's beautiful or not is not relevant to the question of whether it will stand up. You really need hard evidence that it will stand up, and it wouldn't be enough to say, how could such a beautiful bridge possibly collapse? Do you think there's a difference in that respect between perhaps the more pure and applied areas of science?
I mean, I would just say that I think in every area of activity in science, these considerations seems to be getting involved in some way or another. And I think perhaps one way in which we can think about them is that they give some sort of motivation for scientific activity. I think we can find that claim quite often also in science, that, you know, independently of the state of science and independently of what our theory looks like, looking for beauty is actually what kind of is underlying the engagement of the scientist. And I think 𝗏𝗏 put it really nicely, the French mathematician and physicist and philosopher. He was arguing that, you know, beauty, among other things, the most important thing that it does is actually just give us grounds to do science. You know, whether nature is beautiful or not is not a question we can actually address, but we are motivated by this idea that our intellect is craving the discovery of beauty, and we actually are actively searching for it. And
so the search for beauty can have this motivating role for scientists, particularly perhaps in fundamental physics.
Perhaps, yes. Yes. It's very commonly made, that claim, yes, in fundamental physics.
Yeah, just make some questions from the audience then. I mean, here's one. Is there a single concept of beauty that applies across different realms like art and science? Or is the concept really very different in different realms? If it's the latter, then why should we talk about objects in the different realms being beautiful at all? What do you think, Adrian?
Yeah, I mean, I was looking up the definition of beauty.
Doesn't really have a definition, does it?
I mean, it's sort of, I mean, the dictionary definition sort of says it's about sort of providing pleasure to the senses. I mean, I've always had the definition I've heard best is something about the kind of overflowing of the senses, a sense of fullness of the senses, which seems to be something to do with beauty. And I suppose that can apply to both, but it obviously has many ramifications, the notion of beauty. And I suppose that could apply both to science and to art in a way.
I think there's a lot going on, isn't there, in the concept of beauty? I would have thought part of it would also be drawing of attention, that if something's beautiful, you really want to attend to it and in a way appreciate it. There's this magnetism. Yes,
that's also true. And then there's also the question of taste and how we can appreciate things more, the more we're kind of exposed to them, and sort of we can cultivate a taste for things, which is all part of the romantic theory. I'm just really interested, I mean, in what we were talking about a moment ago, really, about the question of aesthetics in science. And I guess at the end of the day, I mean, because we are not just logical things, you know, we are embodied creatures, then we do carry these kind of sensibilities, whether we like it or not, you know. And so in a sense, perhaps things like beauty in science are unavoidable, really, because after all, it's humans who are doing it, and for human reasons. And maybe a science science and technology developed solely by machines that weren't human, or by another creature entirely, would be a different kind of science with a different feeling to it.
What do you think, Milena? Do you think there's a common concept of beauty that is at work in both art and science?
I don't know whether we can make such a claim. And to be honest, I don't even know whether we can make the claim that we have a singular concept of beauty in science. I think one of the interesting questions that is very much work in progress is whether we even have the same concept within the same field. You know, do biologists mean the same thing by beauty as physicists? I mean, that's still something we should figure out. I think something we should be working on actively to understand. I think even with the examples we examined today from physics, we see that, well, we have some scope to interpret this notion differently. And the problem with that is, if we do have that scope, what is this implying for the application of this concept for our rational agreement within, whether, for instance, we're deciding whether to trust a theory. And we also haven't touched upon the idea yet that there are some philosophers and some scientists that are convinced that no matter what this concept actually means, we have good reasons to trust it, to base epistemic significance on our choices based on this concept. And maybe I should say a couple of things about how that justification is usually made. You know, you can give an a priori argument in favor of just assuming that nature is beautiful. And this kind of argument goes back to, I mean, people like Paul Dirac, for instance, who had, you know, religious upbringings, and they usually, this a priori argument will go hand in hand with believing in a divine creator who could not have created a complex world. So we have these kind of ideas, but more empiricist arguments will just look at the track record of our theories, look at the history of science, and try to identify every time we've had a successful theory, what were its qualities, and we will be identifying those common qualities we discussed at the beginning: symmetry, elegance, unity, and we will give an argument there that, well, if a new theory comes along, even if we don't have empirical evidence in its favor, if it is actually fitting those ideals that we have, that have been properties of our most successful theories in the past, surely that gives us some kind of confidence to trust the new theory that came about, even before it's supported by the evidence. And that's a really interesting kind of line of argument, because it then makes us think about what kind of pool of candidates are we working with here. You know, if we're thinking about unity and we make a very romantic reflection on the history of science, we can say, well, yes, every successful physical theory was unifying. Maxwell, Newton, Einstein, they all achieved different levels of unification that were really important for our understanding of the phenomena that they are, you know, aiming to describe. So surely if a new theory comes about that's really unifying, we should trust it. And, well, it's not very easy to justify this pool of examples, because we can have some pretty serious examples of such theories that are...
Yeah, plenty of theories that had those qualities as well that turned out to be completely wrong.
Exactly, that we have basically this alternative form of inference from, you know, beauty to failure. So I'm very interested in where this debate can go, looking simply into those kind of empirical ways of justifying why we trust a theory. On the one hand, we can make a very lovely looking inductive argument that our theories that looked a certain way were successful. And it seems on the other hand, we can actually look at the history of science and look at failed literary
history of science always cuts both ways, doesn't it? Gives you as many examples of success as you like, and then as many examples of failure as you like. Then Vic said another question from the audience. We talked about the relation of beauty to truth, whether there really is one. This is about the relation of beauty to understanding and insight, and the thought that maybe it is skepticism about beauty in science a result of obsessing too much with truth, perhaps, and not recognizing the relevance of beauty to understanding?
I'm very interested in that question because it's very much kind of the question that bothers me the most, worries me a lot in my research, and I'm really happy to be able to address this question. I think it's certainly the case that our discussion so far in the last 20-30 years in the engagement with this subject has oftentimes really been about the relationship between beauty and truth, and whether this is a useful notion, whether we can learn anything about the nature of the world from a beautiful theory. And I think more recently now we're starting to think about other epistemic aims of theories. It's not only truth, it's also gaining understanding. We also are looking at, 𝗔𝗱𝗿𝗶𝗛 𝗓𝗃 are looking into how we employ falsehoods in science to gain understanding about the world. So we have good grounds to think that oftentimes we can have epistemic aims such as understanding that are being met even in the absence of, strictly speaking, truth.
Yeah.
In the full kind of.
And where does beauty come into that? So science is not all about truth. We also want to understand things. Sometimes we use models that introduce simplifying assumptions, idealizing assumptions. I suppose sometimes they end up more beautiful as a result of that. Is there a link between beauty and understanding?
So some would say, I certainly think so. I think there are many different ways in which you can point to that relationship. One of them is to think about, well, when we're thinking about a specific problem, what ultimately are the explanations that we find more satisfactory, that we find more useful in order to accomplish a particular aim? And those would be simple, elegant, and concrete, and as economical as possible ideas as possible. And those economical ideas are really heuristically useful for us to gain understanding of the subject matter and further our activities, whatever that is that we want to achieve. And so in that sense, it's kind of practically useful to be working with beautiful hypotheses because they're just easier for us to understand and use. There's really interesting research in cognitive science that points to that idea, that observes this phenomenon from the very young age of children and how they reason and how they make inferences. The fact that there is systematic preference for simple unifying hypotheses, and that
everyone loves simplicity, even children.
Absolutely, and it seems to be part and parcel of how we reason as agents. So I think there's a lot to be explored about this relationship. Not that truth is not a wonderful concept, of course.
Yeah, maybe we obsess too much about truth in these discussions. Yeah,
it's an interesting hypothesis to think, from the perspective of us as agents with aims that want to achieve things in the world. How is this concept utilized in our practices, and what is it actually giving us?
It's just time for maybe one more question. Do we need to distinguish between apparent and enduring beauty? So can a bridge that's readily prone to collapse be said to have been beautiful? And I suppose in science, the question might be, can a theory that is eventually shown to be false, should we say it was never really beautiful all along? What do you think, Adrian, about apparent and enduring beauty? Apparent versus real, I suppose.
It's an interesting question. I was reminded of that beautiful bridge in Italy, which collapsed. But I mean, it didn't collapse because it wasn't, because it was beautiful, or because it wasn't beautiful. It was just
every
engineering.
Every bridge will collapse eventually, right?
Well, there are some Roman bridges still around, I think. But yeah, indeed. No, I mean, I suppose you could wrap the idea of enduringness into the notion of beauty. I think that would seem quite an attractive idea.
It is very interesting how some scientific ideas are considered beautiful even once considered false. Bohr model of the atom, for example, perhaps Newtonian mechanics, if you think that's strictly false.
Yes, and that goes back to this sort of the things that you've been talking about. I mean, what kept coming to my mind as you and Milena were talking was Occam's razor, really, and just how which is about not multiplying explanations beyond necessity.
Preferring simple theories, preferring the parsimonious.
Yes, indeed, and just how, if we didn't have Occam's razor, then I guess we might just be dealing with some extraordinary, unmanageable, chaotic mess that we could never kind of negotiate through, which is why Occam suggested a razor to cut through all the unnecessary complexities he saw. But that seems quite fundamental to me, really.
Doesn't it raise the thought that maybe the world is actually a chaotic mess? And that we're deluding ourselves in thinking simple theories are better.
Well, you know, in the Bible, God created the world out of chaos, didn't he? Which is the Greek word for gas. I mean, maybe they kind of exist in this sort of dialectic. You know,
it's a good question to end on, isn't it? At the end of the day, do you think we have any reason to think that the world is beautiful, that the truth about the world will be beautiful?
I mean, personally, I don't know if we have reason to think that. I mean, personally, if I just had to put money on it,
yes or no,
I would say yes. But I mean, but the other thing is, I mean, if by beauty we mean something about the kind of, you know, as you say, giving attention, the pleasing of the senses. I mean, don't most of us experience the world as beautiful? If you go out into the woods or into a park or something, I mean, you experience it as beautiful.
Woods are beautiful. I absolutely agree with that. I'm less sure about the world as a whole. What do you think, Milena?
I would say it's no surprise if we end up with beautiful theories, because that's what we're trying to achieve. It seems to be an aim that we're, you know, involved in this covering beauty in the world.
Do you think the truth is beautiful?
I would just try to see what our best theories tell us about the world, and I would accept that. If they tell us the world is very complex, I will accept that, but I will also understand why we're trying to explain things in a unified, simple way.
Thanks. I think we're just about out of time, but thanks very much to both Milena and Adrian for a fascinating discussion. And thanks for all of you for your questions. My apologies if there are questions we didn't manage to get to. And thanks very much to everyone for attending.